Being a teenager in the 1980s in America was unlike anything before or since. You were caught between two worlds, the last generation to grow up without the internet and the first to feel the digital age creeping in. It was neon lights and cassette tapes, empty houses after school, and a freedom that today feels almost unimaginable. The 1980s were peak American adolescence, a decade when being young had its own distinct look, its own sound, its own language. Teenagers were not just a demographic, they were a culture. And that culture was loud, synthetic, and completely alive. If you are someone who values understanding how culture shapes generations, you will want to subscribe to follow along for more stories like this. Now, let's walk through what being a teenager was actually like in the 1980s in America. The Walkman changed everything. Sony released it in 1980, and for the first time in history, music was personal. You could walk to school with your own private soundtrack, playing through a pair of foam headphones. The world around you did not change, but the way you experienced it did. You carried cassette tapes in your jacket pocket. You had to flip them manually at the halfway point. The batteries died constantly, but none of that mattered. You had your music and nobody else could hear it. The mixtape was its own art form. Recording songs off the radio required patience and precision. You would sit with your finger hovering over the record and pause buttons, waiting for the DJ to stop talking, so you could capture a clean intro. If you were making a tape for someone you liked, you agonized over the track order. A hand-curated mixtape was the most personal gift you could give. It said everything you couldn't say directly. The boombox was the opposite of the Walkman. Enormous, heavy, and powered by 8D batteries that drained within hours, the boombox was designed to be heard. Teenagers carried them through parks and school courtyards and street corners. The music wasn't private, it was a statement. Breakdancing culture exploded because of boomboxes. You would find a patch of cardboard in a parking lot, someone would drop the box, and the afternoon would disappear. Home computers were beginning to appear, but they were nothing like today. The Commodore 64 sat on a desk in the den. Games loaded from floppy disks or cassette tapes, taking several minutes before anything happened. Teens learned to write simple programs in BASIC. Nobody called it coding. It was just something curious kids did in the basement. The screen glowed green or amber. The keyboard clicked under your fingers. It felt like you were touching the future. Friday nights meant Blockbuster. You drove to the store, walked the aisles, scanned VHS boxes, and debated for 20 minutes over what to rent. New releases were often all checked out, so you settled for something from the back wall. You had to rewind the tape before returning it, or you paid a small fine. Choosing the movie was half the ritual, and the whole night was about the experience. The mall was the center of teenage social life, not because of the stores, though you spent time in those too, but because it was the place to be. You would walk the same loop for hours, past the food court, past the arcade, past the record store, and then back around again. The food court smelled like Sbarro and Orange Julius at the same time. You nursed a soda for an hour at a table near the fountain. You watched people. You were watched. Social dynamics played out in real time under fluorescent lights. The video arcade was its own world inside the mall. Places like Aladdin's Castle were dark, loud, and electric with noise. Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Galaga, Centipede. You fed quarters into machines and competed for high scores. Getting the top score on a local machine was genuine status. Your initials would sit at the top of the leaderboard until someone knocked you off. Strangers would gather to watch someone on a hot streak. The arcade was democratic. Skill was the only currency that mattered. If you had access to a car, cruising was what you did on weekend nights. You drove slowly up and down the main strip of your town, windows down, music up. You shouted to people in other cars. You circled the same 3-mile stretch 4 or 5 times in an evening. It sounds pointless when described plainly, but it was not. It was the primary social infrastructure for teenagers without money and without destinations. The car was the living room. Fashion in the 1980s was unapologetically loud. Girls used cans of Aquanet to build their bangs into structures that could survive wind. The goal was height. The higher, the better. Boys grew their hair long in the back while keeping the front short, the mullet, which seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Neon was everywhere, pink, green, yellow. Spandex and leg warmers from the aerobics craze crossed over into everyday clothes. When Air Jordans dropped in 1985, sneakers stopped being footwear and became status objects. Kids saved for months. Some parents couldn't understand it. The preppy look ran parallel to all of it. Brands like Izod and Lacoste with the alligator and Polo Ralph Lauren signaled belonging. Collars popped, sweaters tied around the shoulders. These were the markers of the in-crowd. Acid-washed jeans were universal. Denim jackets covered in pins and patches were the bulletin boards of personal identity before social media existed. MTV launched in 1981, and it split teenage life into before and after. Music had always been heard, but now it was watched. Michael Jackson, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper. Their videos were not just promotion, they were instructions. You watched them and you understood what cool looked like, how it moved, what it wore. The visual grammar of the decade was written on MTV. John Hughes gave teenagers their mythology. The Breakfast Club came out in 1985 and told a generation that their internal lives were worth examining. The jock, the brain, the rebel, the princess, the outcast were not just characters, they were mirrors. Teenagers watched those films and felt recognized for the first time. The horror genre ran alongside it. Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees were the monsters of the decade, and teenagers packed theaters to see them on opening weekends. At home, things were quieter and often emptier. Divorce rates had climbed through the 1970s and kept rising. Both parents working full-time was no longer unusual. It was the norm. You were a latchkey kid? You had a key on a string around your neck. You let yourself in, made a snack, did your homework alone or did not, and waited for 5:30 or 6 o'clock. Nobody called to check in. There was no way to call. The phone was attached to the wall. The Cold War was a background frequency in teenage life. You did not talk about it constantly, but it was there. War games came out in 1983 and played directly into that anxiety. The idea that a computer could accidentally start a nuclear war felt entirely plausible. The Day After aired on television in 1983 and depicted nuclear strikes on American cities in explicit detail. Roughly 100 million people watched it. Teachers discussed it in class the next day. The threat was not abstract. It was scheduled viewing. Nancy Reagan told you to just say no. Dare came to your school. The fried egg commercial played on television and told you that your brain was the egg and drugs were the pan. The messaging was relentless. Whether it worked was another question. The language teenagers used belonged entirely to them. Something excellent was radical or rad. Something disgusting was grody to the max. Valley Girl inflections spread from California across the country through movies and television. Totally became its own sentence. Bodacious entered the vocabulary. Word, borrowed from early hip-hop culture, meant agreement. The lingo was a closed system, a wall between teenagers and adults, which was exactly the point. What defined being a teenager in the 1980s in America was a particular kind of freedom built entirely from physical presence. You had to show up. There was no way to be somewhere virtually. You had to go to the mall, the arcade, the drive-thru, the parking lot, the party. If you missed it, you missed it. There was no recording. There was no documentation beyond memory. The decade was happening in real time, fully tactile, completely present. The neon faded. The arcades closed. The Walkman became obsolete. But for a few years, in the middle of the 20th century's last chapter, being a teenager in America looked exactly like that.